Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We got our 7th webinar. We have a fantastic group of panelists from our Ron Brown alumni team. My name is Sam Alemayehu. I'm a 2004 Ron Brown Scholar and on the Board of Trustee with my partner, Meredith Eggers. Meredith?
Hi, everybody. I'm Meredith Eggers. I've been on the board of Ron Brown for a little over a year and a half now. And Sam and I started this. It's crazy that this started almost 8 weeks ago. And one of the things that we just want to make everybody understand is there's no question off limits. Don't worry about making anybody uncomfortable and expect to sometimes be a little uncomfortable. That's why we're doing this, so that we can actually move things forward and have a real and raw conversation. So thanks for coming.
Awesome. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction of Ron Brown Scholars Program and our fantastic guest. And today is STEM and science. So I'm super excited. My inner nerd is tingling. So the Ron Brown Scholar Program is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of African-American leaders. It is so important for our community to remain connected. That's why we have this platform. The scholarship honors the legacy of the late Secretary Ronald H. Brown through a selective scholarship program that advances higher education for community-minded and intellectually gifted African Americans. Ron Brown supports students before entering college through the Guided Pathway Support Program, or GPS, during their college years through the scholarship and mentoring, and after graduation through mentoring and networking. Today, you will be able to see kind of the alumni list within the pipeline. And as there has never been a better time to call onto that pipeline of leadership to discuss some key important topics and around science and STEM's, as well as innovation's role to bring about racial equity. We have Jon Piper. Jon is a Ron Brown Scholar, class of 1998. He's on the advisory board. He is Chief Scientific Officer at Min Software, based in Ohio. Alexandra Sailsman, she's a Ron Brown Scholar, class of 2009, process engineer at 26 Incorporated. And we have Professor Dr. William Tarpeh. He is a Ron Brown Scholar, class of 2008, and an assistant professor at the Department of Chemical Engineering at Stanford University. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in. First, I'm going to start with you, Jon. We have been talking about both COVID being a great reset and what is happening right now of individuals being open-minded to address and tackle racial injustice. What do you see kind of the role of race as well as kind of racial inequality in the world of STEM, and especially from an innovation field?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think it's a two-way street. The racial inequality and its effect on innovation, and vice versa. I think it's an interesting interplay. So for me, I work in the medical software field, and so I'm very much focused on innovations in medicine, specifically for driving better cancer treatments or diagnosis of various diseases as well. And the science, the scientific data that is there is showing us how much disparity there is in how disease affects African Americans versus a white population, how intense that could be, how some of the morbidities with interventions can impact, and then even the access to care. The later stage of diagnosis means fewer options or worse options for treatment and worse prognosis, et cetera. And this tends to be a theme throughout a lot of the areas that I'm specifically working in and focused on. So the impact of inequality on outcomes in medicine and science, scientific inquiry is one of the things that's showing us that. But there's not enough of it. So, when you see the recommendations by, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and things like that, they tend to couch when they talk about African Americans. So they say, the data is showing this is worse, but we don't know what to do about it because there's not enough research. that really allows the statistical power to be there for us to know what should we be doing that we aren't doing, or how could we be tailoring medicine more effectively to level the playing field. And I think that's a major issue that I see in my kind of daily work. But if I flip the equation and I say, okay, well, what about racial disparity and its impact on innovation or its impact on science? Well, part of it's already kind of encoded there. We're not looking as much at these racial disparities because the people who are underrepresented aren't calling that out, right? So, there aren't, Black voices that say in science as powerfully that say we need to be looking over here in my community, not just a general population analysis, which is never typically powered to see, these effects on a racial level. So we're missing that insight. We're missing that voice that would point us in that direction. And not to get a bit ahead of myself, I'm talking a lot, so I'll stop.
No, I love that. I think, yeah, we definitely will come back to kind of tapping onto that. But the one thing that the theme that keeps on coming up in a lot of the various conversations that we've had so far is in each individual sector and field. Everybody could say, in criminal justice, it's very easy, it's direct. You could pinpoint to it. It has been talked about. In many other areas, it hasn't been. But the ramification is massive. So one of the conversation was a very personal kind of story that last week Danielle Bowie shared with us. Her son has sickle cell anemia, and the lack of research around sickle cell, around kind of those kind of diseases that affect the African American community have massive ramifications. Alexandra, I want to come to you on kind of in your field, in kind of the engineering manufacturing sector. Where are you seeing kind of the role of innovation as well as kind of the overall lack of addressing racial kind of inequality affecting your entire sector and field?
So I think as engineers, as designers, it's completely missing from the corporate and industrial approach to design. I probably going to get into sustainability. I'm big into sustainability right now, and one of the pillars of sustainability is social equity. If we're not equal socially, that system is not sustainable. Like, there will be tension, there will be war, and rightfully so. So for me, from the manufacturing perspective, I think what we forget as designers, you sit down at your cubicle and you do it in a vacuum, but this isn't done in a vacuum. I'm a material scientist. What does raw material extraction do to the earth, and whose communities are next to industrial complexes typically, or centers that have mining? And then how do you fabricate them? Who's fabricating these things? They're typically Black and brown people, and whether it depends on the country. And I think we do need to also approach this globally. My instinct, of course, is to think of the United States, but to think globally. Who's stuck in fabrication, manufacturing? Is the health and safety there in the workplace for them? And then, of course, ultimately the disposal. Where does all of this go after our products have seen their end of life? We learn about life cycle analysis of materials in school, and I haven't seen it at any company that I've worked at. I've worked at 3 or 4 companies at this point in the past 7 years, and it's never brought up. And where do things get dumped?
Right.
It's not here, it's not in my backyard.
Right.
In the United States, in the suburbs, we're shelling it off to other countries. And that's missing. That's missing in designed obsolescence, and it's missing in the overall approach to manufacturing and design.
No, that's really important. And usually, what you see is when you could get away with dumping like that, then all of a sudden you're not pushing into innovation. Right. That could have come up with kind of those type of things. So, and I want to pull you in, Will. kind of your background in academia, as well as kind of research around wastewater treatment. And these are kind of areas that usually end up addressing the needs of the type of communities that Alexandra is talking about, because it is bringing about that innovation. If people think they could get away with the cheap methods, they're not financing your innovation. So what is kind of the role of kind of inequality, as well as the lack of representation in academia, and what are you seeing becoming kind of, what is the right way to start tackling it?
Yeah, I think Alex has brought up a great point in terms of life cycle assessment, how we think about disposal of new materials even as we make them. This is something that in academia we're seeing. It's something I teach in my intro to chemical engineering classes. It's something we're now putting into the curriculum. But at the rate we're going, and this is typical of many topics when we talk about diversity and representation, it's going to take a long time until we see the fruits of what we're doing now, right? The students I teach they're not going to be the head of their companies, most of them, for like 5 or 10 years. And I mean, even in Silicon Valley, we have the advantage that startups are very common. And so we can get some transformation that kind of a roundabout way, in that a student who just graduates or leaves school can start a new company, and that can get other bigger players to start thinking that way. I think, so all of that to say, I think training is one of the biggest things we can do in terms of functioning in academia, is getting students to consider the environmental consequences of everything that they design, and getting them to not think about design in a vacuum. So I think one way that I think about that as a chemical engineer who works on environmental problems is that the term environmental engineer is useful to us, but in some ways it makes it seem like environmental engineers are the only ones who need to think about the environment. But in fact, every engineer should be an environmental engineer, in that they should think of the environmental consequences of the technologies they design. And this goes from hardware all the way to software, right? When we talk about artificial intelligence, sometimes people in computer science think like, oh, what does my work have to do with the environment? Oh, the carbon footprint of huge data centers is really big, right? Everything is connected. We don't have the luxury of thinking in a vacuum anymore. So for me, that's where I approach things. In engineering, we've increasingly, over the past couple of decades, started talking about community-centered design, which seems very basic and very straightforward as a concept, but it has entered engineering more because people have seen a need for it, and frankly, because people have been calling for it. And it's hard work to get it recognized in the same way that a science paper or a nature paper, these big journals are recognized as like big breakthroughs. But at the same level, so is getting something to work in partnership with the community for the people you're designing for, right? And so there's all these other things baked in. Sometimes we think academia is like different from industry, and it is. But that doesn't mean it's devoid of the problems of racial animus and lack of representation. It has those same issues.
No, that's really important, because one of the things in this article that we were talking about earlier, the thing is, it's the strengths and difference, and kind of the direct goal there. How can you hope to solve problems that threaten all people by working only with some people? So,
right.
So kind of the power of that inclusivity, and can you talk more about the more the diverse the team is, and kind of this question is for everybody there. The more diverse your team is, the more you're able to really tackle the problem in a way that addresses everybody's needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can
please, yeah.
field that one. I completely agree. I think diversity, one of the major issues that I see when I think of innovation, and by the way, I'm obsessed with innovation. It's what I think about day and night. And when I think about how do you innovate, where does innovation come from? It is almost universally somebody thinking in a different way than everybody has always thought before. Right. And when I look in my field, in my specific area of STEM, but STEM generally, you look around and diversity is limited. We are, African Americans are severely underrepresented. Women are severely underrepresented, and so you're sub-selecting out a very narrow view on what where the new ideas can come from. And so, I think that is extremely limiting. So you talked in terms of, we're not solving the problems of everybody around us, but we're also, which is absolutely true and absolutely part of the problem, but it's also massively stifling our ability to actually innovate, to come up with new ideas and new ways to solve problems. Not just because we're not hearing voices, but we're thinking down the same paths every single time about the same problem, and we know the definition of insanity, and that is, it's amazing we have as much innovation as we do, when you see these kind of disparities, I think.
And anybody else want to add more on that?
I would just add, I think now in engineering, we're starting to, in academic engineering, we're starting to identify diversity as another grand challenge. And this, in some ways, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but the National Academies of Engineering, sort of the most distinguished American engineers, get together and define these grand challenges for engineering. Things like reimagining the nitrogen cycle, artificial intelligence, all these big challenges that they think engineers should work towards. And that kind of trickles down into like what gets funded at the national level, like in turn then what research is done and what are the hot things that new professors are thinking about doing. And so increasing diversity has become one of those grand challenges, to use that like insider lingo in engineering. And now it's slow, but people are really thinking about it as an imperative, as an absolute that we have to do. Like, you can't be competitive and not be diverse. And so that is, so it's a little bit of like playing to the incentives of a system kind of from the inside, is using the logic that's like, hey, Stanford, your reputation is built on being one of the best institutions and your reputation is really important to you. You're gonna fall behind these other schools if you don't accept diversity as an imperative. And so that's been one of the biggest levers I've seen for change at these elite institutions that are focused on making the next generation of world changers, right? We have to define it as an imperative and work within the incentives of the system while we're trying to change the system, transform the system completely.
So to that end, to that point, what specific actions, I mean, some of it's pretty straightforward. We need more Black and brown people in the room, but we got to get them there. So what are some of the things that we can all be doing and should all be doing right now to affect that change?
I talk a lot. Will, I was interested in that grand challenge, diversity being one of the grand challenges. I think it's a really interesting concept, because all of the grand challenges you're typically solving with engineering, right? And is that the approach that they're trying to encourage? I had a really interesting conversation with a PhD in human resources who was talking a lot about baking into your culture a diverse, an inclusivity, into your culture, where you hire people based on their ability to work with people who don't think like them, where you coach people on effective communication and sharing of ideas with people who don't think like you. And I think we've all seen, places in the workplace where that's not a reality. And to me, that, to me, those two ideas connected, where, that's essentially engineering diversity by engineering inclusion, by engineering the principles by which those are effective. I'm curious on the grand challenge question, because I think this is a great example. Is that challenge about not funding programs or projects that aren't diverse in representation, or is that challenge about actually engineering solutions to a diversity problem?
Yeah, I think it's both. And on Meredith's point, it goes all the way to like individual actions we can take, like within a department, within a research group, even within a cohort of students, to be more inclusive and establish that environment where everyone feels like they can speak up, because if someone is holding back, then we all lose out. And when I say someone's holding back, I mean, we haven't made them feel comfortable enough to share their ideas and be okay with being wrong, because that's where innovation really comes from. So that kind of, maybe it's micro scale engineering, or it's just like individual reflection and changing your individual actions, all the way up to like how people interact is also a system. And so we can engineer it in a way by engineering incentives, right? And people get incentives for, sometimes it's like you get an extra hire if you hire someone from an underrepresented minority group, or there's extra funding somewhere, right? And that's I don't mean to cheapen it by monetizing it, but I mean to say like we have to use incentives, which often are like money and power, to like really change how things work and how people behave. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, part of the incentive is that you build a better product that is attractive to more people, that you sell more stuff. I mean, in that very, so, and I also think it's not just Black and brown people's responsibility to get more Black and brown people in the room. So the incentives it has to become so clear to hiring managers, to team builders, that a diverse team, for lack of a better word than diverse, is a better team. And we see that every time a diverse team gets built, but I guess it takes some people a while to get their brain around it. How do we help them do it?
Alex, what do you see at the company level?
At the company level, you know, I want everyone to support diverse and inclusive work groups, but I don't want it to stray into tokenism, though, and I don't want it to be a lip service type of activity, which I think is more, I mean, companies kind of just stamp out this boilerplate like, oh yeah, you're different and we care. And I'm over that. Like, it's, people don't see and people don't talk to you to see that authentic side of you. So I'm sitting here like, yeah, how do we do this? That it doesn't result in being invited to the table, but like that's like forcing kids to play together that don't want to, you know.
Right.
No, that's really important, and I think kind of to the point of, if we recognize that, and you say this earlier, Alexandra, if we recognize the biases that we all come with, then you are admitting your limitations. But a lot of times those biases are not kind of recognized. So kind of my question to you is, one, what kind of change can we bring by other sectors and stuff trying to highlight? We're starting to see it with this AI bias and kind of the programmer, the test subject, or the data that has been used, but also the limitation of how much STEM and sciences can really do much without other sectors kind of playing a role and highlighting it as well.
Yeah, I mean, scientific inquiry, it should be informing policy. It should trickle out into all these other aspects of our lives. I think, honestly, we need a degree of humility. Like you say, once we can all acknowledge each of us has biases, like, it's not like you said something problematic and like hammer, like we're at some point, someone's got to just lay it out there. And I don't want to put the onus on Black and brown people who are already in a marginalized and unpowerful, you know, not an enfranchised position. Like, we shouldn't also have to be the ones being humble, like, oh God, like the rest of the world is trying to humble us for us. You know what I mean? Other people are going to need to step up and say, yeah, you know what, I was wrong, and like, let's talk about this. A little humility would go a long way in generating these teams.
I think another part of that is like, we're all in, no matter where you work, you're in some sort of room or virtual room where decisions get made, and they might be really small decisions. But one of the things that feels great for me is like when I'm in faculty meetings, sitting around with lots of other faculty members, and I'm one of the youngest ones, and I'm the only Black one. What that means for me is like when something happens that I find unacceptable because of racial discrimination, and it doesn't have to happen in the room, but maybe we're talking about it, or it has someone says a comment that is like, that's not, like, I disagree with that and I'm not sure I can speak up about it. If someone else speaks up about it, I feel like intense relief because I don't have to put me on the line to hold the whole room accountable. And so that's a little thing you can do. So some of it might be as simple as like, you can follow up with a colleague after a meeting or something and say like, this sounded weird to me. Was it weird to you? And that's great. But then what I really want to see is you speaking up next time so that I don't have to, right? And so then we can change the conversation. And so sometimes people talk about this as allyship, and that's important, but also sometimes people get more concerned with the name ally than the action of being an ally. So I would just push you to say, like, if people are walking away like, what can I do? You can think about the spaces you're in on like a day-to-day basis, even if they're virtual now because of the pandemic and some of us working from home. But you can think like, what can I do to make this a more welcome place for someone with a different experience? And I think that's because like, I feel so much relief when we're talking about whether it's a candidate we're bringing in and someone says something offhand and I'm like, that sounds like a racist remark, or like, that sounds like you don't think I should be here. If someone else speaks up and is advocating for others, I think that's one of the best things we can do.
Yeah, the other side of that, and maybe this starts touching into mental health or kind of the intersection Black and female, but someone says something like that and it's like, no one else said anything. Did I imagine that? Like, holy crap, almost like a gaslit. You're like, am I overreacting? Does no one else care? And then there's already imposter syndrome in the scientific field, and to add that layer of like uncertainty and self-doubt where it doesn't need to exist. Someone whose self-esteem is shot, they're not bringing their full self. That's also going to hurt you as a team.
Yeah.
I think viewing it as a risk too. So I think Will and Alex both, you're talking about the things that make Black people uncomfortable in their environment, and those are throughout academia and corporate America. And if your company is a place, or your team is a place that isn't a comfortable place for underrepresented people to feel comfortable and to be able to thrive, you are presenting yourself with a risk, and part of this is just risk mitigation, and you need to, and I often frame things in terms of risk because it's more actionable. Like, if you're going to take my $10, that's worse for me than if I get $10 from you. So thinking in those terms, or communicating in those terms around, like, you are company A. If you're a place where Black people or women don't want to be, you are at risk of being disrupted by company B, who hears those voices and who can bring that innovation that you can't, because you are a single-minded, or there's diversity within groups as well, but a less diverse kind of environment or team. And yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And to piggyback a little bit, Will, or both of you, what you're saying is educate yourself. I mean, I think that's the thing about bias, is you don't know you're biased until you go out and learn a little bit about the world around you. And I think that would be my, one of my big takeaways is, just read a little bit. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if you're not reading a little bit, you probably have no idea what you're missing. And you wouldn't even know that your team's not a place that a certain group isn't going to feel comfortable. Unless you start hearing, these conversations, or, reading some of these great articles or books that are out there.
Yeah, I think one more. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
I was going to, and isn't that the root of science, is this curiosity and to go out and explore? And how have we fallen so far? It's, if it's all going to be books, calculations, which are fun, and I have a spreadsheet for everything, but that isn't that what got us in this to begin with? And why doesn't it affect other aspects of our lives? Why don't you want to learn about new people, new food, new customs, and to see someone else's perspective? I think maybe that's a way to tap into that nature that a lot of scientists have. Yeah,
I think two more examples. One, I think I was talking to some colleagues earlier today, and one of the things that was striking to us was that scientists and technologists, engineers, we're researchers. We love to find out information. We use Google Scholar and Google all the time to figure out things, especially technical things. But for some reason, when it comes to interpersonal things, we feel like someone should explain it to me, right? But we pride ourselves on self-teaching. And so we were kind of joking that like sometimes my answer to people is like, Google it, right? Like just like look, like apply the same research mindset you have when you don't know a scientific concept to when you don't understand a concept about race or racial equity, or you feel yourself being defensive about something. Like Google the word microaggression and like read the literature. So in academia, we're very like data driven, and it's like we need to read the primary literature. And like, so if I come in with a paper and I cite it, it's like a much more, that's how you make a better point, right? And it's like, there are whole schools of researchers who work on race and educational equity. And so there is literature here that we can cite from. One other example I was gonna say, just like what Jon was talking about in terms of like educate yourself, is like the simplest, like learning a simple fact or a simple concept can really change how you do things. So for me, like one of the things that, this is on more the gender side, but I think it's worth mentioning as well. It's like women are interrupted at like 80% more than men in meetings, right? And when I read that, I was like, that's crazy. And I asked my wife, and she's like, duh. And but then I just started paying attention to it, right? And then the simple thing that I can do is when I see a woman get interrupted in my meeting, in the research group meetings that I run, I just say, hey, man, like I don't say man, I say the person's name, but I say, Will to the person, or Sam, she was talking. Let me hear what she has to say. Or if I don't want to be that pushy, I go back to the woman who I heard her start to say something, and I say, what did you say? I want to make sure I heard it, right? And so these are the little things we can do to just interrupt a stop that we know it without interruption will just go badly. But if we just intervene, and it costs me very little to do that, right? Especially when I'm leading, I can just make sure all the voices are heard. So that's a small thing.
Agreed.
Earlier, someone had brought up kind of this discomfort of speaking up, especially, you know, if you don't feel safe or you feel threatened in your work environment, potentially by, you know, the opinions and worldviews of others. Easier to just shut down and sit through the meeting, right? I'm not going to open my mouth. It'd be awkward as heck, but sit in a meeting and point, like, you know, maybe you've discussed all your topics and go around the room. Do you have a comment by name? Like, what are your thoughts on this issue? And, you know, everyone has to speak up and say something, and slowly that comfort level with expressing themselves, you start getting more ideas brought up. Because once we're in the room, that doesn't mean everything is solved and hunky-dory. Like, unless you're also hearing and listening, you've really not gotten anywhere. We just look better on brochures, like.
Right. So true. So we've got some questions coming in, and I want to try to get to some of them. And I'm going to do what everybody who's listening knows, that what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to take some of those questions and put them together so that we get to answer more questions. So there are a lot of questions here that go back to medicine and medical care. So I'm just going to start and say, in terms of smaller scale and immediate action, what are some of the things we can do to lessen disparity in medical attention and coverage for Black and brown people or Black people? And are there any organizations that the Royal We can all participate in or join to know more about how to improve that? Jon, you want to start with that?
I feel like that might be directed at me. And I feel woefully ill-equipped to answer that question. Let me come back to that. Let me noodle on that for a minute.
Okay. All right. I'm going to read another one right here, and I'm just reading it directly, so let's hope I get through it. In each of your respective companies, how helpful or impactful is it to have a diversity position X at a company or university that is only available for a person of color? For example, an academic track where there's an internship, or a tenure track that is specifically for a person of color? Or is that counterproductive by forcing someone into that diversity label, that sort of, as we were talking about earlier, the token?
And just to clarify, so you're not saying like there's a headcount position that can only be filled by a person of color. You're talking about having someone on site who's like a diversity and inclusion rep, but that role always defaults to a person of color.
If I'm interpreting this correctly, it's that what if there was a tenure, let's say at Stanford in the engineering department, there was a tenure track that was always held for a person of color, or there was a role in an organization, in a company, it's, I guess, a little bit odder, maybe a board position that was always for a person of color. Is that, and I've just gotten clarification that that was the question.
I think I can speak to this a little bit from the academic side of things. So in terms of faculty hiring, I think there are a few different mechanisms, and this ties in, I think, to another question someone's saying about like when institutions get it right. Sometimes there are mechanisms where there's a general search, but if one of the top winners of the search, of the job search is a person of color from some group that's deemed underrepresented, then the department will either get some money from the department doesn't have to foot the whole bill for hiring someone or for paying for their startup, and which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, or the department can hire 2 people instead of hiring just 1. And so that's what I mean when it's like that's how from the university level you get the departments to you incentivize them toward diversity, right? Now when that happens in academia, we tend to stray away from explicitly saying someone is a diversity hire, in part because of the second part of your question, Pendia, if I'm getting that right. So I think one of the best things we can do is make sure that when someone is hired in and they're from an underrepresented group, regardless of whether there was some incentive behind the scenes, is we need for that person to have sponsors and advocates who are making a way for them and introducing them to people. And some of my senior colleagues have done this for me. They talk about me like I'm like the best thing that happened to them. They're like, have you met Will? This is what he does. And I appreciate that sponsorship so much because it counteracts. I mean, obviously I've seen my life without that sponsorship, and what that looks like instead, or can look like instead, is people assume I'm not a professor, because if I'm not, even if I'm wearing what professors wear and I'm with all the other professors, people assume I'm not a professor. So when one of them introduces me and said, this is Will, my newest colleague, he's doing this, it's going to change the world. So that's what we can do to stray away from frankly, the negative stereotype people have that a diversity hire is not as good, right? I'm just as good, if not better, than the rest of the candidates in the pool. But you would assume I'm not, because that's the society we grew up in.
Yeah. I think, Will, to that too, I think it's so important. I think it's very, very hard at this point in time to say, well, there isn't a diversity candidate who has the skill set. Look at, even if we just take the Ron Brown scholars world, we can fill any role with somebody from this organization, but maybe they haven't had access to the experiences, their resume doesn't look quite right. So to your point, it's everybody around that person's responsibility to make sure they get all of those things that make them more comfortable in the room.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think in academia and lots of places too, we talk about like the pipeline problem. And just like, maybe this is polemic, I just reject that completely. Like,
I totally agree.
There is a pipeline problem, but we're just not looking hard enough. And part of that is because I grew up in terms of going to college knowing the Ron Brown scholars. And I was like, what do you mean there aren't talented Black people? I know 400. Like what, like you aren't looking, you don't know where they are. And then it becomes clear now when people send out job ads and I'm like, oh, do you want me to send this to this list of, and I described the Ron Brown scholars or the Ford Fellows or something. And they're like, that exists? And I'm like, I can't, this is why you think there's a pipeline problem. You don't, yeah.
Right.
And I want to loop in Salmana Diallo, a 2006 Ron Brown scholar who commented on the chat, but I want her to kind of share her experience specifically around organizations that have helped kind of build that more, not just a pipeline, but making sure that the pipeline is fit into and kind of that individuals that are hiring are connecting with those pipelines. Salmana, you're in, unmute and join us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. first of all, thanks so much to the panelists for this conversation. It is inspiring and just powerful to hear. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania and studied engineering and was actually the only Black woman in my entire class, which was unbelievable given that I graduated in 2010. But I remember that being a member of the National Society of Black Engineers really provided me with community and empowered me to continue to study engineering, even though I really didn't see anyone in the classroom that looked like me, whether it was students or professors. So I'm curious, in your careers, given that I'm sure you're in environments where there are not a lot of people that necessarily look like you, how and where are you finding strength and community to really kind of empower you to keep moving forward?
Thank you. Who's taken? Alexandra?
I'm I'm struggling. It's been a huge weight on me in my career, is that I've never really had a community. I work with middle-aged white men. I don't work with anyone young. I don't work with anyone Black. I don't work with any other women. Like, I have a private stall in a company in the United States. Like, I do, because there's no women. There are 3 other women at our office, and I'm the only one in a technical field. So it's been very hard to find community. So I really feel for you, Salmana. But I may not have community in the sense of people who look like me, but having community in people who are willing to listen, because if eventually far in the future, hopefully not far in the future, but it certainly feels like it some days, you know, we all have this respect and can listen to one another. Like, all of you are my community, or should be. So honestly, I've just had to find people who are semi-sympathetic, or at least don't yell invectives when you stand up for yourself. And it's like, this is like the wet wipe bird bath version of a friend when what you want is a hot, refreshing shower. Like, it's not, it is what it is for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think echoing that, you know, it is about finding the warmest voices in the room, and the most open ears, and building community around that. And I think for me, the RBSP, you know, program is a big part of how I supplement, you know, my community with an outside community, and I think that's a big part of it for me personally. And I think a big wake up for me is, you know, in recent months has been that I've gotten so used to the groove of, you know, the world around me is so white that I haven't actually noticed the places where it's not as so. And I haven't forged those kind of relationships in the places that I could be. It's been an interesting, like, introspection that I've really been, you know, grappling with over the last few months. You know, am I being the best, you know, ambassador for Ron Brown and keeping the door open and the ladder down? I think there's ways that I can be creating more space and more community for the people that are around me. So for me, it's been, you know, this is also like part of my call to action personally, is really looking for those opportunities, creating those opportunities, to create greater community for other people, and ostensibly for myself.
Yeah, I think another thing that happens that we can take advantage of nowadays is like remote mentoring, or like mentoring from afar. So if you're the only Black one at your company, in academia, like science, Twitter is like a real thing. Like a lot of us talk about our papers on Twitter and stuff. But one thing that's been happening that's really great is like they'll have like there's like Black in Chem Week or Black in Neuro Week with a hashtag. And that's been cool to see, because then Black students, faculty members, recent graduates are meeting each other and just talking in a way where you can connect. Even if 10 people are the only one in each of their departments spread around the world, they can connect about that experience. And you can see a role model ahead of you, whether it's a professor if you're a student, or a tenured professor if you're not tenured yet. So there's some of those things that you can take advantage of too.
And I just to Alex, because I think about what you said and being surrounded by a group of they're just not your buddies. They're not going to be your buddies. But if I can say one thing that maybe will sound trite, I think you've probably had a tremendous impact on all of their lives. And you may be unfortunate enough that no one ever bothers to say, hey, I'm a different person now because I've gotten to work with you. But I promise you that's the case. And like I said, I don't mean for that to sound trite, but good for you for showing them what they need to see.
Thank you. No, I don't take it as trite. I appreciate it. It'll get me through some hard days.
I was often the only girl in the room, so.
Yeah.
Let's see. I had another one I wanted to bring back up. Okay. So, and I actually had to, sorry. We've got questions in two places. So this is originally directed to Will, but it really is to everybody. I think everybody on the panel is going to be able to guess the RBS person who's asking the question. And I will say that I actually had to Google to find out who Audre Lorde is, because I have not read her. But here's the following question. Do we need to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And everyone on the call, you now have a reading assignment. Look up Audre Lorde.
That's a tough one. You know, I truly am obsessed with innovation. You know, one of the opportunities that I think is under discussed is the hack. So you can disrupt, you can work within a system, or you can find the hack that allows you to disrupt without disrupting. And I think, you know, this is not me saying, you know, this is the answer, but I think that's the interesting kind of space is cheating. And can we disrupt can we take down the house without anyone realizing we took down the house? And you know, what tools do you use? Well, it's probably going to be a combination of you know, disruptive tools and system tools. You know, this is you know, me pontificating more than anything else. I think there's an opportunity for both, and I think you know, if you come in disruptive, you're not working with you know, the system, and if you come in to blow it up, your opportunities are more narrowed. But if you come in to change from you know, within and find those hacks, not play by the rules. I'm not talking about playing by the rules. I'm talking about changing the rules and changing the mindset around not playing by the rules. And that, to me, I think may be where some of the opportunity lies. And I think the timing is, you know, it's not often that the news cycles, you know, look favorable on Black America, and they are, and it'll change. But I think there's an opportunity if we can rally around this to make some lasting changes in this time, in this moment, and I think, you know, this may be one of the ways to do it. We've got I feel a little bit more empowered. I feel a little bit more grace and patience around me from the powers that be, that allow me to kind of push some boundaries that I wouldn't have felt comfortable pushing before.
Yeah,
I feel the same way. I think, yeah, Chris, I also laughed because I was like, that is such an amazing English professor question. It's like open-ended. It makes me think. Yeah, I think starting off, we and I in part two was more, I've envisioned this as a spectrum. And so I was closer to saying like work within the rules, but definitely not to the exclusion of imagining a whole new system. So I think for me, it's like, I think the metaphor that Jon continued to think about, like which tool do you need in which situation, I think is really, really useful. So to drive it home, I guess, so like one example is like working within the system, like as a faculty member, I have extra power and weight in what I say in my department, right? I'm literally at the table in the room helping make the decision. So like what we just did is we got rid of the GRE, the grad version of the SAT. Why? Because it doesn't indicate, again, data-wise, it doesn't indicate potential for the skills you need in graduate school. And it's known to be a better predictor of socioeconomic status than it is of potential, right? And so it's like, who is this keeping out? Oh, poor students. It's keeping out Black and brown students. So we can just get rid of it. It doesn't cost us anything to get rid of it. We don't use it that much in our admissions. So that's one way I'm working within the system to get rid of something. But then at the same time, I'm writing proposals to say, like, how can we design a whole new system of how we train students so that a graduate student doesn't leave our department without knowing basic, or not basic necessarily, but without knowing Black history, right? So even in an engineering department, how do we train our students? And the incentive there is that, like, at Stanford, we train many of the future faculty in the world, right? And so if those future faculty members don't know about Black history and about marginalization over the past 400 years, then they're not going to serve their students as well. And so we have to use this role as a leader to create change, right? So I'm working on kind of both of those ends, let alone within my own research group, to try to create change. But definitely, I think to students out there, like there's this whole spectrum of what your like activism and your resistance looks like within your setting. And so like all of it is fine. We need people in every part of that spectrum.
So I've got a question here. And again, this is one that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit to incorporate a couple of things. But a common thing that we're hearing from STEM students right now is in a virtual classroom situation with COVID and not knowing when they're going to get back, everything feels like it's sort of been blown up, and internships have blown up. It's a broad question, but it's certainly something that is on the minds of a lot of students. Any suggestions, solutions, notes of inspiration?
At the university level, one thing we're thinking about is what challenges has COVID given us that we can turn into opportunities that even post-COVID we will still adopt. So one example is, for our department, I run our REU program, and I normally don't use acronyms, but I'm saying that so that if you're a student, you Google REU, right? Research experience for undergraduates. These are things where you go to another campus. Well, this is like pre-COVID. You go to another campus usually, could be your own as well, and you do a 10-week internship in a professor's lab. These are great ways to put on your graduate school resume, figure out if you like research, etc. So anyway, I run that program at Stanford in chemical engineering. And we found out in March, like everyone else, that no undergrads were going to be able to stay on campus. And so we had to innovate fast, right? And so I basically went around to all my colleagues and got people to do remote REUs, right? And so this is hard because students aren't in the lab, but it's like, can we put iPhones on our graduate student heads, and like, can we use GoPros so that students can see what's happening? Can they do literature searches? And so we ended up making this whole program for them. And then my department chair is like, that's an amazing program. We should do that all the time, right? And so that's something that like, we wouldn't have done this in a normal year, but it's something we can turn into. So maybe it's when you're emailing professors to ask if they have positions, you can offer ideas like, I'm happy to do a literature search, or I can work remotely in this way, or I'm happy to do this. And that way you can coordinate with a professor for free, right? Because we don't have to pay for you to do, if you want to do it on a volunteer basis, or you're able to overcome the fact that no one can be on campus, right? So these are the ways that you can start to think outside of the normal modes in order to get the experience you want. Or maybe it's like you just tune in on a group meeting, right? That cost us nothing. And in academia, we're fairly open to that. And then you just get to know graduate students, and that leads to a mentoring opportunity. So I know it seems like a lot of obstacles, but also try to think innovatively, and you shouldn't have to do this, but try to think outside the box. And I'm happy to talk more with people about how to make the most of these remote opportunities.
I think maybe to address like a younger age, I don't know if that's where we wanted the question to go, but man, am I jonesing for like a sabbatical-esque experience. Like COVID is hitting, and I know it's terrible, but I'm almost looking at people who were like furloughed from work and were sitting home and they were knitting and they were catching up on Netflix. And I'm like, there is so much I'd want to read, write, study. And I am just like at my wit's end, running on fumes, trying to work and like grocery shop and in this new world order, trying to get everything done. I wish we would like stop with the mile markers and like whatever 10th graders are supposed to learn, like pick something that you are interested in, go to or use ebooks or like ye old-fashioned library. Like I want to read things. Maybe you're very interested in learning a new skill. Young kids wanted to like garden or something, which was like a great outdoor activity for COVID. Like, could we not have like little remote pockets? Like maybe if there were a bunch of kids interested in science that they just spent that semester working on a science project themselves, and they could like use Zoom to coordinate with other kids in their class when they run into issues. Like I feel like there are a lot of life skills and a lot of ways we can learn and grow in this time that people aren't really considering.
Yeah. Sam, anything else you want to add? We are coming up on the end of our time today.
Hour, as you say, but yeah, we're getting a whole lot of wonderful questions as well. Let's try to kind of sneak in maybe one or two.
Yeah, so actually, I'd love to sneak this one in. So as scientists and engineers, how do we fit into the movement for Black liberation? As people are beginning to imagine an abolitionist world with no police, there's a lot of design and engineering involved in that process of rebuilding. So how can we be sure to center Black innovators in that process?
We're expecting you to solve all of the problems today.
Yeah, just
in this 1 hour.
You've got 3.5 minutes to do it.
Go. This won't answer the last part of the question, but man, if I'm not ready to live in the future. And I'm like, people keep holding me back. Like, y'all are thinking too small. I don't want a minuscule edit to our current to kind of make it fair. If you were going to start from scratch for how we would interact and live and work with one another, what would you do? That's where I want people to start. Like, if you had nothing, because the systems kind of suck, like totally suck. So why if there's a lesson learned or if there's a system that's working well, then maybe you'll adopt something similar. But just imagine that you had nothing, and where would you go? Like, let's be really revolutionary about this instead of a small tweak, which is still not enough. And then we're back here again, and my daughter is fighting this fight 20 years from now.
Right. We can't let that happen. This we can't.
But what you see, one of the big challenges in there is, especially in the US, which is kind of staying back in imagining the future and being the future. Even if you see the movie or the TV show Westworld, the future of LA is filmed in Singapore. kind of like they're showing, oh, this is what LA looks like, 100 years from now. And they're filming in location in Singapore and Barcelona and places like that. And one of the big reason is kind of this socio-economic and racial inequality have really limited the country from investing in infrastructure in a more inclusive way, and really stifles innovation. If you're continuously saying, I built them myself, this is me, I'm gonna create my own little island of kind of, I'm gonna keep my wealth and things like that, does not allow for a whole lot of that innovation to happen. But where do you see opportunities with this kind of COVID being a great reset? Where do you see opportunities for innovation in STEM? And John, you were discussing this a while ago, to advance racial equality. Where are kind of some of the innovations that you see that are happening around racial equality?
Yeah, I mean, my view is, I try to position myself in places which are all tides rise, with a bias towards this tide rising will have a bigger impact on the people that need it the most. And it's quite the opposite of, revolutionary. But it's the place where I feel most empowered personally. It's a place where I feel like I can move the needle. I know what I'm able to do and what I'm not able to do. And I think, I can tie this back to where can we have a short-term impact on medical disparities. I mean, if you go into your problems with that mindset, you can move the needle in a place where you can move the needle, but you bias the needle that you choose to move based on the one that's going to have the bigger impact in the sphere that you can influence. So for me, that is medical software innovations, and so prostate cancer, Alzheimer's disease, these places where I can help move a needle, and I know that needle is going to have a disproportionate impact on people who need it the most, because they're disproportionately affected by these things. If I can have a slight bias in that direction, I can do something that's going to have a greater impact than somebody like me trying to re-social engineer things. That's just I'll have two mittens on in that process. So that I guess that would be my quasi answer to that question.
I think I would draw an analogy to what I was talking about earlier with like every engineer needs to be an environmental engineer. Like you have the luxury, many of us have the luxury and increasingly to work on the problems we find most exciting. And hopefully if you're in school, you are able to think about that. And sometimes you're not, which is okay, but hopefully there's a time where you're able to choose which problem you're going to work on. And in that way, we can choose to work on the part of our problem, like the needle, that advances Black liberation. And so for me, what that looks like is like, I could work on toilets and wastewater anywhere in the world. I do it in sub-Saharan Africa because that's where I want to do it. And as long as I can, as an academic, I have to write grants to get money to fund students and projects. As long as I can get people to buy into that vision, no one is going to ask me questions about it. I do it because I want to and because I think it's important, right? And absolutely that's a luxury, but this could go all the way down to like, what do you study when you're given a class project where you have choice? Study a problem that disproportionately affects Black people, if you want to. But why not? We might as well work on solving the issues that affect the Black liberation movement. And that's something that Black innovators have done throughout history, right? Like Madam C.J. Walker designed a whole $1 million company based on Black women's hair, right? She could have done it for every woman's hair, but she said, I'm going to focus on Black women. Am I saying all of us need to innovate only for Black people? No, but I'm saying it's okay if you want to.
Okay if you want to, absolutely. Awesome.
Yeah, this is wonderful, guys. We really appreciate it. And we want to tie in for next week. We have a special date. We're going to have an event on Tuesday. We're going to build on science and innovation, and focus on entrepreneurship and unlocking capital. And we have special guests and two alumni that are going to be on there. And a special guest, we have the chairman of Microsoft, John Thompson, joining us to talk about this and to build on this conversation. And we expect all of you guys to join us next week as well. Again, I want everybody to help me in thanking all our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the honesty and the sincerity. It's helpful. We all appreciate it. Signing off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.